What is a Florida shuffle? The term Florida shuffle refers to a disturbing and deceitful practice prevalent in some rehabilitation circuits in the state. It describes the cyclical movement of patients between detox centers, sober homes, and treatment facilities, often without substantial therapeutic benefit to the individual. Instead of focusing on genuine recovery, certain unscrupulous facilities use this shuffle to maximize insurance billing. The shuffle is fueled in part by federal laws requiring insurance providers to cover addiction care. As a patient's insurance coverage for one type of care is exhausted, they are moved to a different type of facility or service, regardless of its appropriateness for their treatment. Federal laws like the Affordable Care Act and the Americans with Disability Act, which were created to help those in need of health care, are being milked by people looking to line their own pockets. It's a billion-dollar rehab industry that, rather than treating addicts legitimately for addiction recovery, some unsavory individuals and organizations have used loopholes in a system designed to help those in need while cashing in on people suffering from addiction through insurance fraud. There are close to 1,500 drug treatment centers in the U.S. with more than 1.6 million clients. Florida has hundreds of these rehab facilities, earning it the name the recovery capital. Brokers get kickbacks to lure drug addicts to certain treatment centers for their insurance policies because there is no limit on the number of times you can go through rehab yearly or in a lifetime. There's more money for rehabs in relapse than recovery in the Florida Shuffle rehab scams. Since 2008, the Affordable Care Act and the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act have offered medical coverage for drug rehabilitation. All medical services, such as treatment programs, are done on a fee-for-service basis with no annual or lifetime limit, with relapses are also thoroughly covered. But things then quickly change and the shuffle begins. Those coming out of state for treatment will need a place to live, also known as sober homes. The outpatient stage is when the individual leaves the rehab facility and enters a group home to continue recovery. Typically, recovering individuals are required to pay rent as they are living in the group home. However, some sober homeowners will either drastically lower or remove any payments for rent with the expectation of receiving money from the rehab facility, which charges thousands of dollars to the insurance company. The plot thickens. Sobriety is not only discouraged, but seen as unprofitable. The hope of sobriety for many starts at a rehab facility, but those facilities can vary widely, and there's little regulations keeping them from preying on the most vulnerable. Once all the insurance benefits are drained, the person's phase in outpatient care is done, and they leave the sober home. If the person finds himself relapsing, this will begin the process all over again. And with that, these crooked sobriety providers will find themselves profiting from this revolving door of individuals trying to reach sobriety. In 2022, 22-year-old John Doe was desperate for help from his addiction to different controlled substances, including fentanyl. Without the ability to withdraw and detoxify himself, he researched and found this inpatient rehabilitation facility, South Florida Rehab Facility in Lake Worth, Florida, and voluntarily checked himself into their medical detox and residential program on June 8, 2022. Only 21 days later, on June 29, 2022, John died, and his estate filed a 3-county wrongful death personal injury case against the facility alleging negligence, violation of a vulnerable adult in violation of Florida Statute 415.101 and violation of the rights of individuals in violation of Florida Statute 397.501. Unfortunately, John had unknowingly become a pawn in a billion-dollar industry accused of making money off addiction. In this insider-exclusive Justice in America Network TV special, Justice in America, the Florida Shuffle Rehab Scam that preys on addicts, our news team sits down with Jason Cornell, attorney at Clark Fountain, Littky-Rubin Whitman, to discuss how their client's death could have been avoided and to discuss their novel lawsuits, not only alleging negligence, but violations of the Adult Protective Services Act, alleging the deceased was a vulnerable adult under the Florida statute, which required a certain level of care he was not given. Jason will discuss this Florida shuffle problem. Many Florida rehab centers focus on profit rather than proper care, leading to a cycle of treatment and relapse called the Florida shuffle. What can be done legally to stop these places from exploiting vulnerable patients, as well as accountability for bad treatment? If someone receives poor care or is harmed in a treatment center, what legal options do they have or their families have? How can we make these centers more accountable for the care they provide? Chapter 415 of the Florida Statute focuses on adult protective services and typically involve the Department of Children and Families or the elderly population, as it involves allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. This statute defines the protected class of persons as a vulnerable adult, which means a person 18 years of age or older whose ability to perform the normal activities of daily living or to provide for his or her own care or protection is impaired due to a mental, emotional, sensory, long-term physical or developmental disability or dysfunction or brain damage or the infirmities of aging. Chapter 397 of the Florida Statute focuses on substance abuse services, which define recovery residence as a residential community that must remain a drug-free living environment. Armed with statutory language not typically argued in a wrongful death case of drug addiction. Prior to taking several depositions of the facility's employees, including its security manager, the firm was able to settle the case at mediation without ever reducing their demand. In recent years, the state of Florida has worked to change its perception. The Florida Association of Recovery Residences was founded in 2011 and aims to make sure treatment centers are up to par. Certification, for one thing, that's been a big game changer. A lot of law enforcement have shut bad actors down. So either put them in jail or put them out of business. And many municipalities have imposed an ordinance to require sober living environments to be FAR certified if they're going to participate in their communities. This case exposed a well-oiled machine, specifically in South Florida, where fraudsters enroll people like the decedent in their 30-day program, get paid daily, release them at their most vulnerable state back into an uncontrolled environment, which ensures their return for another 30 days in profit, and awaken the industry and the government to promote some level of safety and financial responsibility in that market. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jason Cornell to the show. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you, Steve.
Let's talk about your firm a little bit. What does your firm specialize in?
Thank you again, Steve, for being here. Clark Fountain, we specialize in taking cases that other attorneys sometimes are not sure what to do with. And by what I mean by that is we handle automotive defect cases where a vehicle is defectively designed and if it might cause a catastrophic injury or death. We handle complex liability cases, meaning facts that arise that lead to, again, catastrophic injury or death, but the complexity of how that arose, sometimes attorneys are just not sure what to do with those cases. So they pick up the phone, they call us, and we are referred cases like that throughout the country.
Today we are here talking about the existence of a real problem in the rehab industry in Florida. And it's referred to as the Florida Shuffle. What is the Florida Shuffle?
The Florida Shuffle is a phrase that acknowledges an industry that is underregulated, profit-driven, and it's no secret that South Florida is home to a large amount of drug rehabilitation centers. And the shuffle involves clients, patients, sons, daughters that come in and out of these facilities. And these facilities focus on volume and instead of quality and instead of outcomes. They focus on profit, which results in staff that are being improperly trained or supervised. And so the shuffle is the harm that can result from an industry that really needs more proper independent audits and regulations.
Right. Their profit motive is not to rehabilitate you, but to continue to rehab you. In other words, the more cycles they can run through with your insurance company, the more money they make, correct?
Correct. And sometimes, unfortunately, these patients who are trusting these facilities with 24/7 care, they're not being properly served. They're not being properly supervised. Families and these individuals come here to get protection from themselves. They are fighting one of the most difficult epidemics this country has seen, and that's the opioid crisis. So they're coming for help. And these places are staffing them with individuals who are recently out of recovery themselves, who lack clinical experience. And it's a for-profit model that is just ripe for failure points along the way. And when failure points happen in a rehabilitation center, people die.
Now, your firm represented a client who remains anonymous. The case was settled confidentially. Tell us a little bit about what you can regarding the rehab center where this client checks himself in, correct?
Yeah, so Steve, on behalf of the family who are our clients, I want to thank you for bringing attention to this, because the only way these industries are going to change is if they're confronted with their failures. And so thank you for that. A young man, 22 years old, checked himself in to a South Florida rehabilitation center because he was dealing with what millions of Americans are dealing with, that is an opioid addiction. So 2 weeks after he's admitted into this facility, he's found to have overdosed and has died in his room. His roommate also overdosed. And so we brought litigation, and what we learned through the litigation and through the discovery process, there were several failures along the way. One, the window in this room these two gentlemen were sharing opened up to a public street. There was supposed to be security alarms on these windows. The alarm wiring had been cut. It had been retaped together. And more importantly, the facility that he had entrusted himself in had protocols that they would inspect and check on these patients every 15 minutes, because on paper, they knew these individuals needed to be monitored. That didn't happen here. So they were able to, with this tampered alarm system, get access to a cell phone. They were able to purchase fentanyl. They overdosed on fentanyl. The roommate survived, but unfortunately, our client's son, he died. Had protocols been followed, inspections would have occurred every 15 minutes. More importantly, they would have inspected the room and realized there was a security breach that could have been easily fixed. And they had Narcan on property. Narcan is a very powerful drug that can reverse an opioid overdose. When you overdose on opioids, your breathing stops. That's what happened here. The autopsy showed that this gentleman had a prolonged period of deprivation of oxygen in the brain. The Narcan was never administered. So there was failure after failure.
It wasn't administered because they weren't checking on him.
Weren't checking on him until it was too late.
Every 15 minutes, they might have caught it, right?
Or more importantly, in one of those 15 minutes, they could say, hey, we've got a window here that has an alarm on it that's not functioning.
Now, I think it's important, and this case never went to trial.
That's right.
It was settled, and it was settled for a dollar amount, which is confidential, but it was a dollar amount that your firm asked for and was never challenged, right?
That's correct.
Because there were so many violations of what they should have been doing. They should have been checking on him. So really, the question comes down to, why weren't they doing this?
The answer, unfortunately, is simple. If profit is the number one driver, if volume of patients is a driver, then until people come forward and hold them accountable If the government's not going to hold them accountable, then unfortunately, families who are harmed, individuals who are harmed, they have to bring actions against these people. And this rehab center knew they did not want to stand accountable in front of a jury of their peers and let the facts unfold in public. That's why we reached a confidential settlement, which is very common in our business as far as when defendants realize they have acted inappropriately and caused considerable damages, they resettle with us, and they often demand those settlements be confidential.
Right. I have read that in the abuse of, let's say, the loopholes of health insurance, where they have to provide, if you have a health insurance, where they have to provide rehabilitation for drug addiction, alcoholism, that sort of thing, that there is no limit as to the number of times that you can keep going back and seeking rehabilitation. Is that right?
I've seen that. Now, policies vary, but I have seen policies that have those provisions, and those provisions can be exploited. And that's when we talk about the Florida Shuffle, something we're seeing. And these providers of treatment, they're aware of this loophole, if you will, and they do exploit it.
Yeah. Now, your firm actually did a very creative approach in successfully resolving this case. And that is, explain to us a little bit about the legal strategies, like taking advantage of a statute called the Adult Protective Services Act.
Yes, so there are certain statutes that are intended to protect children and adults. And if you have an entity that violates the provisions of those statutes, that can be negligence per se. And that's what we have here. And that's very compelling in front of a jury. If you say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, your legislators have passed a law for you, and it requires certain duties be met by providers such as drug rehabilitation centers. If you put that up in front of a jury and then you show item by item testimony, documentary evidence of failures along the way to meet those duties, that's a breach of duty, and that can be either negligence or that can be gross negligence. And we did that here, and we showed that here, and that's why they said, let's resolve this.
Because it was in their best interest. Do you know if conditions have changed at this rehab facility?
That's a good question, because once we resolve the case, we no longer are able to continue with discovery. What we did discern was after this young man died, that they saw this as an unavoidable incident. There was no criminal investigation. There was no major changes or policy shifts. So unfortunately, the way to get these people's attention is to require them to pay for the harm that they've caused. And we've seen this in other industries as well. Remember when the rollover cases from years and years ago where tires were failing and people were getting catastrophically injured or killed. Fortunately, we're seeing more and more tires are becoming safer. Same with the airbag industry. We saw that in the news. There's food poisoning cases we've handled. We're seeing that those are less and less, hopefully, because of what we've been able to do representing people who've been harmed.
Yeah, so let's use a real example here. Let's say I'm a parent that has a vulnerable adult child that is addicted to, some drugs. If I send them to a facility, how can I go check on them, or can I check on them to see if the facility is really trying to rehabilitate them or just taking the insurance money?
That's a challenge, as a parent, wonder myself. I have a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old. They too are exposed to the society we live in, where people are dealing with addiction every day. And we also have a society that values privacy, and HIPAA protects the privacy rights of adults. So when you are enrolling, if you have to do this and you're enrolling your child or a family member or loved one in one of these provisions, you want to know that you're going to have access to see that audits are being followed through on, what they're showing, and hopefully your adult child will consent to allow you, meaning if they are buying into this rehabilitation program, they recognize that this is in their best interest if a loved one has access to hold them accountable. And it really does take active follow-up. And this is troubling for parents who might believe that the best care or facilities for their children here in South Florida, if they're in Ohio or California or Seattle or any other city or state throughout the country.
This case took how long to resolve, by the way, from the time you filed it?
It took over a year, and that's typical for us. You know, what's happened here in Florida lately is courts have begun to expedite from the time you file a lawsuit to the time you get to a jury trial. And that can typically happen in 18 months, depending on the nature of the case. So from the time that we investigate and file suit and then begin the discovery process, it's very easy for a year or 2 years to pass. But courts more and more now are following the federal model, saying, no, you're going to get to a jury trial quickly. How that benefits a family, like in this situation, is the defendant, the rehabilitation center here, they can't drag their feet. They have to either put up or shut up as far as whether they're going to defend this case or they're going to resolve it. And here they wanted to resolve it.
Do you know, as in this case, did the regulatory agencies step in after it was resolved confidentially?
Not while we were in, no. And what was concerning is even before the audits that were done, it had gone months before this place has been audited. And that's what we're pushing for here is criminal penalties when these situations arise, to hold people criminally accountable for what they've done. Here we had an executive director who, before he was in the rehabilitation industry, he was in waste management. We had an owner who had a hands-off approach. We had limited clinicians. 2 nurses wrote 2 reports after this incident. And so that's what we're trying to change here.
In this industry, is there a ratio of clinicians to patients that's supposed to be followed?
If there is, I'm not sure as far as the exact, and so I don't want to be, give you improper information. I will tell you, though, what is in this industry that's endemic and problematic is patients become technicians. And here we had over 50% of the technicians that were tasked with looking after these individuals dealing with their own recent recovery. It's a peer support program that there's a place for it in appropriate numbers, but when it's the key component of your business model, that's ripe for problems and failure.
In doing research on this case, I came across the phrase body brokers. Would you define what body brokers are and how they play into this scam?
Body brokers are basically working, finding people to come to these facilities as far as feeding this pipeline and looking at these people instead of as human beings who are suffering with opioid addiction as commodities that are able for billing purposes to maximize recovery from insurers. And there are third parties that play a role in that.
So they're actually paid, if you will, kind of a referral fee by some of these recovery homes to bring people into the pipeline.
That's right. And if lawyers do that, they can lose their license. Yet that seems to be okay in one of the most fragile sectors of our economy, and those people who are fighting addiction. And those individuals do not have our clients' or their children's interest at heart, not at all.
It seems to me that one of the ways to solve this problem is have a limit on the number of times that you can go through recovery that an insurance company will pay.
The concern there is yes, that does address the issue of just the shuffle or the cycling through time and time again, taking away those incentives. I have represented in my career, I've been doing this for about 25 years now, individuals who have been wrongfully denied by their insurers. And what we don't want to do is have a solution that has good intentions but bad consequences. So we don't want to enable insurers to say, no, you're tapped out here, and deny family the treatment they need for their children.
Is there anything else you want to add that particularly interested you in this case?
Again, I've been doing this for a long time, and the tragedy here is just really hard to fathom, because we're talking about this almost from looking down on it. But behind all of this is a family who's still to this day hurting. It's tragic in the fact that they trusted an organization that failed them and failed their son. And until either regulators and legislators take note of this and start addressing some of the problems, until more of these suits come forward and families say, no, we're going to hold you accountable for what we do. We're going to continue to see this because we're in a capitalist society, and these things happen when profit is put before care.
Yeah, and I do want to add that had your firm not done the discovery that you did and discovered, the lack of security, for example, the window opening up to the street where people and cell phones they're not supposed to have, right? That this case may never have been a case at all. And I'm sure there's other ones that these recovery homes just cover over.
We get a lot of our cases from attorneys calling us to say, I'm just not sure what to do with. And if we had not gotten that call here, maybe this organization, their practices would not be exposed. And that also plays into the important role that journalists like yourself bring to look at these stories and say, hey, other people need to know about this. And so it is a confidential settlement, but we do appreciate, you literally shining a light on what's happened here.
Well, I want to thank you for the success you had in resolving this case, and I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.